Great. Good morning and back to the House Environment Committee. We are no longer in executive session and we are welcoming Matt Chapman from the Solid Waste Division on various solid waste topics. The first of which will be, well, it doesn't matter what order you take them in, but on the agenda, it is the DEC miscellaneous bill and the areas that are relevant to your division.
Great. So for the record, my name is Matt Chapman and I'm the director of the Waste Management Prevention Division. I think it probably does make sense to start out with H 632 and sort of walk through the two sections that align with my division and sort of explain what it is that we're proposing to do. And hopefully, I think they're fairly straightforward. So I have two sections. They're actually sections 1 and 2 of the bill. The first one relates to a report that is supposed to be coming from the agency to the legislature on embedded batteries, power walls, and batteries in cars. And what this proposes to do is push the date out 1 year and shift the person who's providing the report over to the producer responsibility organization as opposed to the agency. Basically, the two reasons for doing that. One is that the PRO is in the process. So Call to Recycle, the entity that manages batteries, manages rechargeable batteries in a number of different states. They're doing a very similar report in a number of different states. So rather than us sort of reinventing the wheel, we asked them to just basically provide the information that they're collecting in these other jurisdictions. That's basically the same on embedded batteries, and it would provide it to the legislature along with whatever recommendations for collection and management that they recommend. So it would align with those sort of other reports coming in and shift it over to the PRO. Probably just worth noting that there are a number of different entities that will ultimately actually be collaborating on the report. So all of these different battery segments are managed by different trade associations and sort of the commerce field. So they're all working together. And my expectation is, and we've been working with them collectively, that they would all feed into the ultimate report that comes to you. So that's the first section. I guess I'll pause and if there are any questions.
Representative Chapin.
I guess in that case, if we're expecting recommendations from our agency,
Sure.
And yet it's coming from this private sector, can you just talk about how you would make sure you are up to speed and you're making recommendations directly to us?
Absolutely. So the report would come to you and to us. And I think at the end of the day, we're the ones who are ultimately going to be making the recommendations. But it makes a lot of sense from an efficiency standpoint if they're collecting all the data and frankly looking at what the sort of best way to recycle, and really embedded batteries is going to be the most challenging thing that's out there. I mean, I'll be honest with respect to power walls and cars and EVs, there's a lot of value to those batteries. And it's really, I think, more about educating people and making sure that there are a means to get them from the wall to wherever they need to be recycled. The embedded ones, it's a challenge to get them out of whatever they're in and then appropriately managed. And we're really going to look to the experts on that to make sure that their systems well. But obviously we're going to evaluate what the recommendations are and sort of give you our opinion and feedback on it.
And this is the existing battery PRO.
It is the existing battery PRO.
That's doing the work and they're working across other states.
Exactly. They are. And you are not alone. This is a problem that exists anywhere that's collecting batteries, right? I mean, we are not alone. This is a common problem, and other jurisdictions are basically asking the same questions. How do we deal with these embedded batteries? And so that's getting examined as we speak.
We didn't have the secretary on there before. We're adding that it goes to the secretary.
Right. Well, it used to be the secretary was doing it, and so now it's coming to us, and then we give you the right.
Okay. So you expect that to actually be delivered in a year? Is that the date sheet?
I do, yeah. I that aligns with the deadlines that are in other states, and I think we're working on it now. We're working with these organizations on it now. I think it's very reasonable to expect that by next year we'll have this report available to the legislature.
Other questions on this section?
So the second section that is in my wheelhouse is it's making changes to the existing authority that we have for delivery prohibitions to, I'm going to call them gasoline stations, but they're category 1 underground storage tank, which is basically what you think of as gas station. And right now we can prohibit delivery to these stations if there are a set of violations that they go through, and they're identified in the statute. There are basically 2 changes that we're asking for in this section. Change number 1 is to extend the delivery prohibition provisions to a failure to obtain a permit. So right now, people who don't have a permit can continue to operate their facility without the same sort of authority. Obviously, there are enforcement provisions, but sometimes this is a different tool that we use. And then the other is granting or making it clear the agency has the authority to basically list by rule the violations that have the possibility of resulting in a release to the environment, and being able to have delivery prohibition over those. So again, the major purpose of this section is that when we go out and we conduct an inspection on an underground storage tank and we find violations that basically could result in a significant release to the environment, that we stop fuel going into that tank and get it fixed before the release actually happens, right? And we have an environmental problem. And so this is sort of it is a administrative sort of enforcement tool that we use. We don't use it incredibly often, and we use it just like we would any other enforcement tool, which is to say, we notify people that there's an issue, we give them time to fix it. When they fail to fix it, we notify them that we're coming out to red tag and they need to come in with a plan to fix it. And if they don't do that, then we go out and actually take this enforcement step. So
How do you find out if a tank is in this state? They're buried.
So we conduct inspections of every gasoline station tank every 3 years. So we have a group of inspectors who goes out and both you can open up, you see those sort of like manholes when you drive over we open those up. We have test equipment. We test and look at key aspects of the system. There's also monitoring equipment that we look at to see whether it's functioning the way it's supposed to function.
Representative Pritchard.
Like boroscopes, or I mean, how do you look at the internals of the?
So we don't actually, so I am not a tank inspector, and while I work with them, I don't know acutely everything that they do when they go out and conduct an inspection, but basically you're looking at spill and overfill buckets that are there that basically capture things when there's a release. There's monitoring equipment and alarms that basically go both for cathodic protection and anything within the interstitial space, because it's a double wall tank. If you're getting anything in the interstitial space, that's a problem. So there's a number of different elements that the inspector goes through. I don't know off the top of my head the checklist of things.
Any other questions on that section?
Right. So those are really, those are the S632.
Yep, just a minor one. Any idea how many percentage-wise maybe that don't have valid permits or?
We occasionally have challenges with the operating permit. I mean, this is all foreshadow a different thing. There's very little value to the operating permit in the USD program, right? The standards that they need to comply with are in the rule. We inspect every tank every 3 years, and the permits functionally say, go do what's in the rule, right? It is sort of the legally enforceable mechanism that we use to ensure that if they're not following the things in the rule, that we can point to their failure to follow their permit. There is another bill that has not been introduced yet, but that the agency is in favor of and is working towards, to basically require that everyone comply with the rule, but not require the act of getting a permit. And that basically we would keep the enforcement and compliance mechanisms the same, but not have what I would call functionally the ministerial aspect of getting a piece of paper. So that's not in yet. It's not here, but that is, as far as a percentage of people who are not in, it's, I can get the number for you. Rather than speculating, let me talk to my team in the office and let you know what the percentage is. It's not significant, but it is, there are enough people who miss that step and it's a problem.
Miss what stuff?
The step of applying and obtaining their permit.
That might satisfy my question that it's not a huge significant.
Well, there's very little, what matters is a construction permit, not the operating permit, right? So, you know, if you're putting in an underground storage tank, there's actually a fair amount of review that we do, making sure that the equipment you're putting in the ground is compatible with the other equipment that you're installing, and that there's not going to be an issue with the operation of that tank or the installation of that tank. That's the sort of part of our review that matters in the permitting section that matters. The sort of operating permit is like, now that you have it in, you need to operate it in the way that the rules say you need to operate it. And so, yeah.
Right.
All right.
Other questions?
All right. So I guess the next thing we can go to, and please feel free to take me in whatever direction the committee wants to go. And I guess I would also say, I would love to have this be as much a conversation as anything else. I figured we could talk about the bottle bill and the bottle bill report and sort of where things are at. And yeah, I just want to start by thanking our contractor. I think they did a good job of putting together a comprehensive analysis of the bottle bill and recycling system. And I think it's incredibly challenging when you're doing the type of analysis that they did. There are lots of assumptions. There's a lots of things that went into that model. And so I think that based on some of what I heard from the presentation that was given last week, I'm going to kind of explain how I look at the report and sort of like how I view the report as basically a model that helps give me information that I use my experience and judgment in to help draw some degree of policy conclusions. And I figured it might be useful for the committee for me to give you how I do that, knowing that it is perfectly reasonable for anyone in this room to reach a different conclusion than the ones that I draw from this. But this is a fairly complicated report, and it's a fairly complicated set of issues. And I figured I'll walk through my thoughts. And then you can ask me questions and we can dive into any portion of this that you'd like to. And I think some of the challenges that I see are we had to make some assumptions and we made some choices in the modeling that was done that affect the outcomes that are in the system, right? One of those choices, and by the way, the agency agreed with all of these, is that we're looking at the actual system in the current state in model one and not what people should be doing, right? So we're not modeling in what would the cost of the system be if all the retailers were actually doing retail collection, which at least legally they're obligated to do, but we know that is not really happening in the system. So that affects system costs, and it's something you just should be aware of when thinking about system costs and thinking about the cost of the bottle bill. So that number is smaller than it otherwise would be if the system was doing what it's legally required to do.
So
Yeah,
is
please.
there not a 5,000 square foot exemption?
There's not today.
We keep trying.
We keep trying to do that, but it doesn't exist as of today, right? So that's sort of number one. It is my view based on my experience that there are some assumptions that are used in calculating impacts to redemption centers that are too low. Every redemption, historically, when we've worked with the redemption centers, we've always been told that the number of sorts and the cost of the floor space dedicated to basically pushing cans and storing cans is a major cost driver for redemption centers. It's labor intensive, it's space intensive. Frankly, when 10 years ago or so, when we went through the commingling agreements, the reason we have commingling agreements and tell beer and soda to basically not sort by brand, not sort by container size, is to basically reduce the number of sorts and reduce the footprint in redemption centers. For better or for worse, the redemption centers, as a part of this report, said, yeah, the number of sorts didn't actually affect our costs. And that's inconsistent with what we've heard throughout sort of and it affects the outcomes in the model, right? So putting that out and just sort of noting it. And then the last one, and again, I completely support the way this was dealt with, but we don't have information on how consumer behavior might change if the system changes. So you can't, and we didn't model out how it would make things. If we make the system more convenient, will more people come and will we get better capture in the system? We don't have that information. There's not good studies out there to model the information. The information wasn't modeled. So when you look at model 1 and you model 2, where you have more and more convenient collection in model 2, you don't see any change in capture rates. I think the practical experience from most agency employees is that that's not going to be the case. If we make the system more convenient and we give people more options to so that people have some people who want direct return, they can still have direct return, but for other people who it's better just throw a bag into a container and then have something come back to you a week later, that those options will increase. That the greater the convenience, the greater participation, the greater the capture in the system. And I think we had long talks about that inside as we were sort of developing that, and there just isn't good information to use as the basis of a model. So no one wanted to swag it, right? No one wanted to just make some assumptions up that didn't have any foundation to them. So those are all things that went into the analysis that you just kind of have to know are assumptions and factors that are in the analysis as you look through sort of the top line numbers.
Can you also speak to the risk, sort of the constraint of not raising the deposit return amount? Because that's another kind of box this was put into.
Sure. I mean, you mean raising the deposit from 5 to 10 cents? Yeah. I mean, I think there was definitely, we did not model out multiple deposit rates.
It's one thing I heard them say was they did have data for the 10-cent deposits.
Right. I mean, I think that both Oregon and Connecticut have increased their deposit. I think Connecticut's an interesting example, and we're still looking at some of the data that's coming in from Connecticut. There's significant over redemption in Connecticut right now.
Over redemption.
Think Seinfeld. So it's my colleague, my peer in Connecticut refers to it as the Seinfeld effect.
Yeah.
That she's seeing significant cross-border movement of.
Because the other states have bottle bills, but they're at a nickel.
They're at 5 cents. Yeah. So people are taking.
We want to all go together if we go.
I mean, honestly, I think having some interstate conversations about a change in deposit is a valuable thing to have happen if you're going to change the deposit from 5 to 10 cents. It has an effect. I mean, so the existing systems at about us. Of course, I don't have the number right in front of me, but it's in the mid 70% capture rate, and that rate happens to be the same for both the bottle bill.
If it's 72 in this.
That's thank you.
Everything we heard before this was 75, but.
Well, everybody, there are different numbers that people feed into the system. But it's 72%. So I mean, I guess I'll just take away my key takeaways from the report. I mean, it's useful, but I think from my perspective, it helped confirm a lot of things that we actually were thinking anyway, which is effectively that this current system really is not working. We continue to see redemption centers closing and struggling. We have large areas of the state that don't have are basically redemption deserts. And there's not really an incentive to run the existing system as a system, right? There's no one who basically is in charge of it. There's no one who's basically looking at the sort of totality of the system. The agency continues to support the modernization of the bottle bill, and basically moving towards sort of the principles that exist for extended producer responsibility that this committee has used in other contexts, trying to create a PRO, having some sort of planning and management of the system so that we get better capture and collection throughout the state. I think there's going to be a need. One of the challenges is that we're going to be taking a system that exists sort of without a lot of planning and thought and turning it into a system that is more thoughtful. And so there's going to be the need for transformation, investment, mechanization, and modernization of what the existing system looks like. All of those things are going to require some degree of investment. And then I guess, I think from our perspective, we don't support expansion at this time. I think the report basically showed that you get better capture if you expand the bottle bill. And I think we would agree with that. And there's a cost associated with it. And that from the agency's perspective, that it is incredibly important to modernize and update the existing system before we start expanding the number of containers that go into it. And once we get the existing system updated and sort of modernized, I think that's the time we have a conversation about, okay, is the cost worth the increase in the level of dispersion?
Representative Tagliavini.
Thank you. Expansion, what use types and materials of products? Can you give me examples?
Water, wine.
Water bottles.
Yes, water bottles, wine, teas, juices, are normally the things when we talk about expansion is what we're talking about.
If I could go a little further, we already have, we have corporations right now in this state doing recycling of all those. Do we have a study to figure out if they're doing it more efficiently than the programs we're talking about? And should we have the state in competition with these outside contractors?
So there is a broad-based, I'm gonna call it the blue bin recycling system, but because I think that's what you're
Basically, yes.
speaking to, right? And I guess from the state's perspective, the blue bin recycling system is an effective system. We do an incredibly good job in Vermont of as both the companies that run it and they're private businesses, but they're also municipalities that are in this sort of space that run those programs. They do an incredibly good job, and we have an incredibly effective sort of capture diversion rate, right? Like we should be proud of the work that we've done. That being said, if the agency did not model a no bottle bill scenario. So that's not, if you look at the costs that are embedded in the modeling, there are system costs. So in other words, it looks at what effects does the bottle bill have on the blue bin recycling system? Because they both are sort of working in the same space, dealing with similar materials. And I think it is fair to say that when you look at the costs between Model 2 and Model 3, the sort of the modernized bottle bill system versus the expanded bottle bill system, that Model 3 has a higher system cost, right? So basically it is more expensive from a total system perspective to run Model 3 than it is to run Model 2 from a raw cost perspective. From a per container taken out of the, basically put into the system, it's arguable it's cheaper, right? So it's because you're going to get more capture by Model 3 than you will by Model 2. So I don't know if that is helpful in answering your question.
Somewhat.
But,
I'm curious if there's a way, well, I'm sure there's a way to study cost to consumer, which is gonna wind up being more.
Or, I mean, so I think that I think that what this ultimately ends up showing is that there is a marginal increase in costs and I'm going to call it to the system. And, people will disagree over whether the consumer sees those costs, whether businesses eat those costs. The margins in these businesses are relatively small. I don't know whether that's going to happen or not. So I don't want to predict. I can tell you that the system will cost more. I can't tell you whether those costs get passed down to consumers. And I think that gets difficult for agencies to try and make that, because it's going to be a business decision that each of these businesses and municipalities is going to have to make.
Thank you.
To Representative Austin.
Yeah.
Are there any options for containers? Is there any new technology in terms of containers at all that would make it easier to dispose of?
Well, I mean, there are collection technologies for so I guess it's a complicated question. There's a lot of technology that goes into sorting a container in a materials recycling facility, the blue bin facility, right? To make sure that we're separating materials into the right stream so that they can go back and get commodity value for them. And the Chittenden County Solid Waste District just is in the process of making some significant investments to make a really great materials recovery facility that does a better job of doing that, right? To make there's a number of technologies like optical sorting and there's some, I don't know that we're going to be using AI technologies, but I know that there are some computer recognition technologies that basically look at things. I am not an expert in that space, but I know that there's technological innovation through both mechanization and AI that's going on all the time in these types of areas. So
I guess one,
Yeah, I just want to make sure we're staying. Current conversation is about updating the redemption program and not adding containers. So if we keep our questions there, because we have a lot of things we'd like to hear from Mr. Chapman on.
I'm always happy to come.
We will have you back, and we'll have plenty of other people in to continue to build our understanding.
so can I ask a question?
You may ask another question.
Option 3.
Yes.
I was interested, I think on all 3 options, they weren't taking into consideration the amount of energy used to bring recyclable bottles back and forth, go the driving. And I just thought that was interesting. It's not necessarily a question, but just an observation, because I think there's a disconnect when we talk about savings and costs, that there are these other costs. And you don't need to even respond to it, but I was surprised that wasn't considered.
So there was a greenhouse gas analysis that was done.
Mhm.
There were certain things that were excluded from that analysis. Again, I think because of the challenge associated with trying to obtain information and model. And I think the other thing, frankly, is that let's just say you remove all of the expanded bottlable material from the blue bin recycling system. Those trucks are still running, right?
Mhm.
They still are going out and collecting your garbage and your other recycling. So that's a static cost, sort of regardless.
You have one, oh wait, I would like, you have Representative North, because he hasn't had a question.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I spent quite a bit of time this summer at conferences on EPRs and PROs and packaging and whatnot, and at the end of the day, to me, it all comes down to what problem are we trying to solve specifically here in Vermont? And I'm not expecting you to have the answer today, but when you do come back next time, if you could kind of very clearly identify for us what problem we're trying to solve and how well do any of these proposed solutions actually measurably actually solve those problems. And again, I'm not expecting you to have the answer to that today. I know it's complicated.
Sure. I mean, I think it's sort of embedded in my testimony, right? Like, I think that the problem, at least that I am trying to address, is the inefficiency to Vermont residents of the existing bottle bill collection system and the lack of overarching sort of like infrastructure that exists to make it a more effective and modern system. And so, I think that is what this committee has talked about. And when the agency talks about bottle bill modernization, I think it's a fair question. There are lots of different ways you can collect the things that we're talking about collecting. And if the committee wants to have a conversation about the strengths and weaknesses of those compared against each other, we can have a conversation.
Yeah. To me, real problems would be like, we're running out of space in our landfill.
Right.
There's too much litter on our roadways. And you can measure how well any of these solutions solve those problems measurably. I mean, with metrics, not just like, oh, we think it's going to get better. How much better? And what's the cost? So then you can do cost benefit trade-offs.
Sure.
If the problem is, it's just kind of hard to use our current system. Well, what does that mean? How hard is it? What are we going to save by making a lot of, what measurably are we going to improve for typical Vermont?
So I do want to remind all of us, I needed reminding myself, we have a committee bill already drafted that we did take testimony on this last year. There's good stuff to look back on and remind ourselves when we have free time, because we're going to keep talking about this topic.
So I'm going to ask with the other things on, so it may be best for me to just do a quick thumbnail sketch on a couple of the other things in the 10 minutes that are left. And one of them I'm going to ask is just sort of to take a pass on. So on the UVRL, I know that Representative Holcomb has reached out to the agency. So this is a brownfields project in Thetford, Vermont that it's an old landfill. They want to put a solar array on top of the landfill, and there are ongoing sort of like monitoring and other costs associated with that. I know that there are conversations that are taking place right now between the agency and Representative Holcomb about the proposal that she's putting in. I just kind of want to let those conversations happen before I actually testify on her.
Well, okay,
Excited.
it came to my attention that there was PFAS found in the monitoring wells, and I immediately thought of you, and I thought, and we were talking about other PFAS topics. This is just
Oh, sure.
So that's why it's on there, and I think understanding it, we're not trying to get in the way of any other conversations that are happening. We're trying to understand what's going on there now.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think that it's fair to say that any landfill in the state of Vermont is going to have some level of PFAS challenge associated with it. The consumer products that we've used throughout the past century, they have PFAS in them. They've been disposed of in a landfill, and for especially some of the older landfills that are unlined, those can cause localized PFAS related problems. I would not characterize the UVRL post mills PFAS releases. There are, my understanding based on sort of my briefing on it, is there's no offsite impacts associated with them. There are on-site exceedances. They need to be monitored, and we need to make sure that there aren't impacts to the community, but we're not seeing that at the moment. So it's really a function of making sure that the status quo is maintained. It's a status quo at this particular site.
And related to PFAS, can you just tell us where we're at with your area of jurisdiction or interest, with PFAS and rulemaking, and just to give us a high level update?
It's probably pretty relevant. So the portion that really is in my area is it's called the Groundwater Protection Rule and Strategy. It's basically the agency rule that kind of tells the agency how we manage and how we clean up groundwater. This past week, let me actually take 2 steps back. Earlier last year, the state's drinking water program adopted the 2024 PFAS MCL that EPA put out. So in 2024, EPA issued a maximum contaminant level, which is a drinking water standard for 5 PFAS compounds, and they also included what's called hazard index. And what that basically is it's a formula, a fairly simple formula where you put in the concentrations that you're seeing in your sample results. You do some math, and if the number's greater than 1, you have a problem, and if the number's less than 1, you don't. So that was the federal drinking water standard. Vermont decided to move forward and adopt that federal drinking water standard. There's a lot of other components, and if you want to go into the detail on that, Brian Redmond or Ben Montrose are the people to talk to on it. But in order to align ourselves with that public drinking water standard, we amended the groundwater protection rule and basically the standards for PFOA and PFOS, which are the most commonly occurring PFAS contaminants that we see, went from 20 parts per trillion to 4 parts per trillion under the federal standard. That is the most significant impact. It also regulates some other PFAS compounds we did not previously regulate. Those are all at 10 parts per trillion. So I mean, again, I think the story that you all already know is true, which is PFASs are bad, and the more we understand, the more we are concerned about them. So that rule was approved by LCAR last Thursday, filed as a final rule on Monday, and it's effective on January 27th. So that is very timely. You're welcome.
Folks have questions on the PFAS and water?
So HHW, just to give folks a quick update on where we're at. When over the summer, there was a requirement for a stewardship organization to register with the agency. We did not have a stewardship or any group register as a stewardship organization. So under the law, through the changes that were made last year, the agency basically steps in and administers the program in the absence of the stewardship organization. And there's a recycling fee that gets put on top of that to help deal with HHW reduction and other related issues. So the agency is in the process of standing up a HHW EPR program. We have put an electronic portal out for businesses to register. There's been a lot of outreach to the business community. We've spent a lot of time working on getting people to understand what the requirements are. So that initial registration period's closed. We're about ready to post all of the people who have registered online so their peers can see who's there and who's not. And maybe we might know of some people who we need to contact and educate them on what the requirements are of the law so that they can register now. And the expectation is that the agency's in the process of basically hiring contractors to both look in more detail at what the hazardous waste stream is, so we can do a good job of sort of like allocating costs. And also hiring a contractor to basically help us in the administration of the program, to basically do a lot of the billing and other sort of mechanical work, because it ultimately, at the end of the day, there is going to be a lot of participants who have to pay a nominal amount of money for the administration of this program.
And did you request a date extension because we knew this was?
No.
Oh.
I don't think, I shouldn't say that. There were a number of amendments and modifications that were put in place last session,
Yeah,
and there may have been.
So I'm wondering if it happened. I'll follow up.
Well, everything, so it did pass last year, and I apologize, I can't remember. It was a fairly comprehensive set of changes. One of them was that if there's no PRO, that the agency would step in and become the PRO. And so all of those changes passed.
You know, where they passed, what bill?
They're in an agricultural bill. I think it's Act 54. I will send a copy to you.
Great.
For those end of session,
I have all the language here, and what we sent was 319.
it did.
It got signed into law.
It did.
That's like, it didn't just pass out here, it actually got signed.
Well,
did.
right, so
It did.
it's sent over in 319.
Yeah.
And then 319 got dismembered, and that sounds like it got put into another bill.
I will
Yeah, that'd be
tell
great.
you literally as we speak.
That'd be great, or Grady can.
I'm sure Mike will probably know off the top of his head, but
And then, yeah, when you're ready, we have brownfields on here, but I also would like for you to speak to the tire EPR proposal.
sure. I mean, I guess I'll speak to EPR generally and to tires as a subset of it. I mean, the legislature has done a lot of work on EPR over the past several years. And, I think there are very real capacity limitations within the agency to like sort of take on new EPR programs without additional staffing or resources, right? I mean, we're sort of, HHW EPR is because we're the lead entity on it. It's taking a lot of resources to, sort of get our sort of program out there and in place. Having said that, of all of the good ideas that people have on other EPR programs, we're supportive of looking at tires. Tires are one of those issues that I think all of your constituents have probably talked to you about, and they very well have talked to me about their frustrations, both with the illegal disposal that takes place within your communities. We also need to get control over what I'm going to call wildcat operators, who hold themselves out as fairly legitimate business people, but at the end of the day, they're leaving. They're entering into a lease with a farmer or a landowner and then dumping thousands of tires and walking away from that owner's property. It's a real problem. We've seen it happen on numerous occasions. And we need to make sure that when a reputable business collects tires from you or me, that the person that they're giving those tires to, thinking that they're going to be appropriately managed, is actually appropriately managed.
What does that entail today? Appropriately managed tire?
I mean, there are not, I mean, I will say the recycling options for tires are limited.
Yeah.
You're really looking at disposal options or energy recovery options. There are not a number of good, it would be good, honestly, to have people from the industry come in and talk to you about what they've identified it when we talk to them, that it's a challenge with tires. And I guess I would say, recognizing that challenge, that it's better to have a reputable system for the proper disposal of them than improper disposal taking place on a far too regular basis.
How would we get testimony on the you have a sense of the scope of this problem of the non, legit disposal of them. How do you know that?
It's through both complaints, right? So we get complaints in from the public about either illegal disposal or other issues. And our enforcement process. I mean, we do enforce against these activities. There are challenges with our enforcement process in trying to get compliance out of some of these folks.
Representative Norris.
I can just add to that. I get complaints regularly from farmers in my area. Just people come by to dump tires on their property and leave.
Yeah.
That's definitely a problem.
Just wondering if we had data.
Yeah, that measurable data was great. I agree.
And maybe we'll have you back. I mean, we will certainly have you back. But since we're right up against the hour. Thanks so much for
You're
coming.
welcome. I'm happy.
Thanks, Matt.
You're welcome.
Are folks okay for continuing right now? Yeah, okay. Welcome. Shifting gears, we're going to be hearing about water again by way of Lauren Oates from the Nature Conservancy speaking to us on the Wetlands Executive Order as well as status of the Flood Safety Act.
Thank you for having me, Chair Sheldon, committee members. For the record, Lauren Oates, I'm the Director of External Affairs at the Nature Conservancy in Vermont. It's good to be back. I think I'm joining, so I'm going to share my screen. And while I do that, I'd love to do a really brief, who am I? Potentially seen as like a greenie coming in talking about this bill, but I have an extensive history in the state with respect to flooding. So I wanted to start with that. I moved to Vermont to help the town of Waterbury recover from flooding from Tropical Storm Irene as a member of the AmeriCorps. From there, I worked at the state Vermont Emergency Management for 6 years. In my 6-year tenure at Vermont Emergency Management, I was the state hazard mitigation officer for 5 years. So I have been to literally all of your towns. I have met all of your neighbors. I know your town clerks and your road foremen. I have been working on the issues of flooding in this state for a very long time. And in that role, I was also like hamstrung by what FEMA would and would not allow, and saw a lot of policy issues that I really wanted to fix for our neighbors that are most vulnerable in floodplains and river corridors. So I moved to the NGO community where I could work on trying to alleviate some of those problems. You heard really great testimony last week from Mr. O'Grady. I'd like to just co-sign a lot of what he said with respect to floodplains, FEMA, river corridors, and wetlands. But I would like to dive in a little bit more on a couple of specifics in the Flood Safety Act that was passed in 2024, and maybe take a moment to give you a primer or educate you all if you need it on the difference between river corridor flooding and floodplain flooding. You'll hear it as inundation and erosion flooding, and you'll recognize in these photos that the damage looks very different. Inundation flooding is the flooding that FEMA recognizes through the FEMA maps, and we'll talk about those FEMA maps in a moment. That is when a town or an area around a river slowly fills up like a bathtub and the water slowly recedes. You'll see that in the image from downtowns Waterbury and Montpelier. Those are both from the 2023 floods. And then the erosion flooding is actually when a river charts a new course entirely. It jumps its banks and creates a new path of flow, and it takes out what is in its way, which is often our homes, our roads, our bridges. Fluvial erosion or erosion flooding accounts for 80% of damages in Vermont. So the floodplain flooding, the Montpelier flooding that we think about often and that FEMA recognizes as a risk is actually only 20% of our problem. 80% of our risk, 80% of the damages that we receive are not recognized by FEMA's mapping efforts. And they are therefore a huge vulnerability for development, hence the need for some significant change.
Representative.
And Lauren, can you just, I presume that's by dollar amount in damages, or can you
By
describe?
dollar amount in damages, yet for public funding. public funding. It doesn't include,
While a floodplain flooding bathtub style might impact more people potentially, it's lower cost to.
lower costs. Yep, if you live in a floodplain, a very scary place to live, admittedly. People have experienced repetitive damage. If you think of, I mean, I'm so familiar with Waterbury because of all of my time spent there, but you know, Randall Street flooding, those homes get hit year over year over year. What happens? The structure is still there. You just have to cut the drywall, get everything out of your basement. Significant cost damage, but your structural integrity is still there. If you live in a river corridor, your house might be literally swept down the river. So the mapping, same river, different maps. These are two different satellite images where the red layer is the FEMA mapped floodplain, and that light yellow or pale yellow is the Vermont mapped river corridor. In that first image, you'll see a purple arrow that is pointing to VSP barracks in Rutland City. When that was developed, if they were to be looking at a map, a FEMA map that said, we're out of the floodplain, it's safe to build here. They built there, and that critical piece of infrastructure that houses staff that would theoretically be exceptionally important during a flood are actually in more significant harm's way by being in the river corridor. But that map is not recognized or realized by FEMA. And unless that gets damaged, it is not actually recognized for FEMA mitigation funding because it is not in the floodplain. That second map is down in Wardsboro, and this is a different problem that we have because our rivers move. You'll see that yellow arrow, I hope you can tell, is pointing to the river bank, and there is water, and the floodplain doesn't even cover the water because the river has moved. And again, FEMA's maps do not think of rivers moving on the x-axis, they only consider the y-axis. So that is a risk that is not only not recognized because of the river corridor, but it doesn't even cover a floodplain hazard. I was going to do like a little round table and kind of like go to each of your towns and show you how this is a problem. And then I realized there are so many towns and so many people are on this table. So Representative North, I'm going to pick on you because you are Addison and A is the beginning of the alphabet. And I've pulled out a couple of images from a couple of your towns, Ferrisburg and Virgins, that show you the difference in a flood hazard, floodplain risk, which is the red again, and the fluvial erosion, far more damaging, far greater life safety risk, which is yellow. Yellow and green arrows indicate only river corridor, no floodplain. And that red is the only one that would be eligible for FEMA mitigation funding unless it was already damaged. So those are just tiny snippets in small towns in very, very small one-off roads close to rivers or even across from rivers, as you'll see in one of those images across from the road, that represent significant risk of Vermonters.
Representative Chapin.
Before you move on, can you just touch on those homeowners' access to flood insurance?
So flood insurance, technically anybody can buy in to National Flood Insurance Program. If you are in the floodplain and you have a mortgage, you are required to have it. So that red arrow house, unless they were grandfathered in from a long time ago, they would have to carry flood insurance. Nobody else has to. If they choose to, they can buy in at a lower rate because FEMA doesn't recognize the erosive risk. But most people we find don't.
And would it cover them anyway? Because if it was an erosion damage?
It would cover them because it would still be flood damage. Yeah.
Representative Austin.
This is on the insurance as well. Do you know of companies that are not renewing policies?
Not by name, but that is an ongoing discussion in the like private insurance community, especially down in like southeastern coastal United States, where a lot of insurance companies are just dropping it entirely. The NFIP, I think that Mr. O'Grady mentioned last week, is very in the red. Year over year, very, very in the red. And payouts are, we'll talk a little bit about this later, are continuing to be delayed and minimized, and they don't really make anybody whole after the fact. So what does that mean? when we don't recognize risk through our primary risk agency, FEMA, when we don't have regulations in place that limit development in these high hazard areas, and when we already have a historic settlement that placed our villages and town centers right up against the river, it means a lot of damage to roads, to our critical infrastructure, to our homes, to our farms, to anything that is anywhere near a river. And this continues year over year. If you follow, whether you want to follow climate science, whether you want to follow FEMA funding, all of the trends show that more money, more damages are happening in Vermont and the Northeast in general. So what have we tried? Prior to passage of 21 or the Flood Safety Act, the state and NGOs, this body has tried a lot of things to our credit before getting all the way to regulation. We tried the compelling public narrative, showing photos, going to presentations like, hey, this is very unsafe. And also your risk isn't recognized by the entity that might give you money if you get in harm's way or if you want to get out of harm's way. The state created disaster recovery incentives to say, hey, municipality, if you adopt river corridor regulations that limit development in these areas, we'll give you a higher share of state funding to reduce your local burden following a disaster. That got a little bit of movement after Irene, but really plateaued like 3 or 4 years later. We tried through Vermont Emergency Management, keepers of the FEMA mitigation funds, to say, if your town adopts those river corridor bylaws, not only do you get a higher state share, we'll also give you greater access to mitigation funds through giving you a competitive edge. So your homeowners are like triple, your business owners, anybody in your town is getting like more and more access to funding to support either protecting your structure from flooding or making sure that you get funding post-disaster. And again, so many information sharing, just year over year, over year, over year, we have tried and tried and tried, and we have not moved the needle. And the only thing that really is going to work is limiting development in these high hazard fluvial erosion areas for river corridors. I want to highlight that this is not a new idea. You could go basically to any plan within Vermont Emergency Management, the Agency of Natural Resources, the Agency of Transportation, and you will find that limiting development in these areas is a hugely public safety benefit and priority. It is a huge taxpayer benefit to avoid future development. It is a huge natural resources and habitat benefit. It just checks all of the boxes. And it is a recommendation from a lot of towns who say, we cannot do the administrative burden of following a local permitting process and the administrative burden of being in the NFIP. State, can you come in and help? So much so that VAPTA and VLCT supported the passage of the Flood Safety Act. It's also supported by Vermonters. In 2024, January, the year that Flood Safety Act was rolling through, just a few months after the devastating floods of 2023, a bipartisan polling firm team went out to Vermonters and polled something like 700 Vermonters from across the state and asked them questions about river corridors, floodplains, FEMA, taxpayer dollars, public safety, all of the things, and ended with, based on all of that, do you support limiting development in the high hazard areas? And 2 out of 3 Vermonters said yes. The bipartisan polling firm, and it was bipartisan, Republican, independent, tripartisan, independent, Democratic, or anything else, 2 and 3 said, we would support this happening. We're sick of our neighbors getting flooded. Frankly, we're sick of how much this is costing us, and it's only going to get worse. So, looking at public safety as the primary priority of Flood Safety Act, this body, the General Assembly, had a lot of testimony. They brought in ecologists, river scientists, floodplain experts, agency leadership, and said, what do you need to make this happen? And they came back with a big ask. They said, we need a lot of money. We need a lot of staff. You all know, as you go through budget debates, that's not easy. That's not an easy thing to figure out how to fund, but you did. You said this is a top priority for Vermonters. We can't keep spending all of this money. We can't keep seeing our neighbors getting flooded. Here A&R, $1.75 million for contractual support to move the provisions of the bill forward. 9 new positions, 5 of which are set aside entirely for the Rivers program to work on the river corridor and floodplain provisions. And there was a lot of back and forth on the timeline. I think that's the primary reason I'm here today, is to talk about the timeline and requests for extensions. You can go back to the testimony that tried to balance doing a very thoughtful and robust public education and outreach campaign, a very thoughtful, very prolonged rulemaking process to make sure that Vermont gets this right against the very real threat of the next flood. The General Assembly agreed to 2028 general permit for river corridor permitting and said, you have 3.5 years to get this done. And this is what that timeline looks like for river corridors. Start first with amending the river corridor base map that shows those areas that are already developed and where the rivers team is already managing for flooding. Where can we still develop that would still be a little more safe or practicable? So create this map or amend the map to identify these infill areas and designated centers.
It's cool. I'm assuming we're not using the FEMA map that don't span.
No, this is just for that river corridor. So DEC already has that map.
Okay,
So they have a river corridor map. It accounts for about 1/3 of the stream miles in the state, the really big ones that do touch down where most people are. As part of it, there's a 2-year education and outreach campaign effort. That is, I think, one of the longest ones I've ever seen in statute. Then there is an adopt rules by 2027. This passed in 2024. That is a very long opportunity for rulemaking. I do want to again acknowledge this is a lot of work from DEC staff, and I will talk about how partners across the state have been leaning in both with staff time and financial resources to support moving this forward, because this is an all hands on deck effort. And then finally, like I said, aiming for a January 2028 permit. Mapping, education and outreach, those first 2 timeline, well underway. The Nature Conservancy, through our own private philanthropy fundraising, there's a lot of interest by Vermont donors, by the way, to solve this problem. Went out and said, hey, DEC, let's go ahead and start that mapping. It's a really hard thing to think about the whole state, all 251 plus towns. Why don't we pick a pilot process where you can pick a few towns that have different flood hazard profiles, different development patterns, different political will, different capital. We went forward and worked on 4 towns, created a pilot map, had all the stakeholders that are mandated by statute around the table, and developed a process for those 4 towns that can now be expanded to the full state. So mapping, well underway, but not finished. Education and outreach, that 2-year process. The Nature Conservancy, in partnership with DEC Flood Safety Act staff and Lake Champlain Sea Grant, have been working on a very robust education and outreach campaign. We've been to all of your towns. I checked our list of 66, at least one of your towns in all of your districts, but often more. 66 municipalities have already been outreached to, 25 organizations have been engaged, and that information has been both here's the river science behind it all. Here are all the things I just said to you, and what are your concerns? What questions do you have? It's basically starting the questions and conversations that you would expect from rulemaking. We have 5 regional webinars coming up in partnership with local organizations and the RPCs. And again, just to acknowledge, when we talk about extensions to this timeline, it's borrowed time. We're borrowing time. So what does that mean? What's at risk? That second line in there is just if you take anything away, take this away. A house built in the river corridor today is a buyout that we have to pay for tomorrow. Hard stop, it's going to happen. Vermont taxpayers are spending tens of millions of dollars annually on disaster recovery. 18 months delay, which is what is being put before you, equates to 1.5 or 2 construction seasons. And again, unless your town is one of those 10% that have already adopted river corridor regulations, you might just look at the FEMA map and say, I'm safe. I'm going to develop there. You're not safe. The average buyout cost right now is $375,000 per structure. 262 homes representing 262 Vermont families are currently in FEMA's buyout application queue. Those applications have been submitted to FEMA and are not getting funded. That number is as of mid-October, and they have not changed. There are several dozen expressing interest in applications, and importantly, that is happening in a drought year where people aren't thinking imminently of flood risk. When we have a flood, even if it's not in your town, the interest in those applications spikes. I know because again, I managed this program for a very long time. And really, really importantly, something that is different in the calculus of it all, since I was here last, is that this is all happening as federal funding through FEMA is constricting. Just earlier this morning on Senate Natural Resources, the Director of Vermont Emergency Management gave an update on their funding, and it looks pretty bleak. Layoffs were mentioned, lack of ability to even appeal because applications aren't being denied, they're just being kept in a queue, so they are just in purgatory. They are not getting funded. And why that is important is because for a long time, our approach to dealing with our floodplain river corridor problem has been to invest in buyouts. Our buyout program is impressive. Again, it's something I worked on for 6 years. I stand by it. I was like one of the most important investments that this state can make with respect to giving money back to the people who have lost everything. And that money is maybe not around anymore, or it's not around very quickly. So if your home was wiped down the river and you have to wait 4 years to get your check, where are you going? How are you recovering? I say all this to say that the status quo is not working. This is not a new plan. I showed you this is not a new idea. It's in all the plans. It's supported by Vermonters broadly. It was passed into law in 2024. The provisions of the timeline of the river corridor piece are moving, even if they might not be moving at exactly the pace as expected. It is very close to. So the question remains on what is the benefit of the 18 months? I'm, again, a former state employee. I cannot empathize more with the workload and burden that state staff have to manage, but we have to balance that against public safety. And we have to consider how we are prioritizing our public safety, our neighbors' safety, our financial investments. I'm not going to read all of this. I sent this testimony in so you all can check it out, but this is on the Agency of Natural Resources website that basically is saying you have to break this vicious cycle or we will never get out of it. And I don't want you to forget about the wetlands. Again, Mr. O'Grady last week spoke at length to the wetlands provisions, not only a little bit, he touched on them in the Flood Safety Act, which require a 2-to-1 restoration ratio. So for any acre of wetland that is taken out of production or its natural state, 2 acres have to be restored in the same watershed. And that's in recognition of the exceptional role that our wetlands play in not only retaining water in periods of extreme precipitation, but also, as evidenced last year in our extreme drought, holding on to that water and making water available in times when we do not have enough water. I think that Mr. O'Grady called them our lungs, like they breathe and move with the system, and they are there for us when we need them in times of flood, in times of drought. They improve our water quality significantly. They act as a carbon sink, so they are good for air quality. And we have lost our wetlands to the tune of 35% in Vermont. For a long time, the state has been working on a 2-to-1 ratio. It's also in all of those plans that I noted, maybe even more. And we've been doing it slowly, but it hasn't been codified into law until the Flood Safety Act. That rulemaking around changes to the Flood Safety Act provisions for wetlands has been delayed and been leapfrogged by the executive order in September. So when we talk about timelines and deadlines and how we prioritize public safety, flooding and drought and all the costs and pain associated with that, I do just want to acknowledge that we can move quickly. That executive order was passed in September and rulemaking is almost done. And that is to take wetlands out of production. So not only does that directly implicate that 2-to-1, it's leapfrogged how we rulemaking around that. So I leave you where I started, just another the same images I started on, with a plea. I've spent my entire career working on this. I'm getting older, so like when I said that a few years ago, it might have sounded laughable, but I have gray hair now. I have 2 kids. Like I've been working on this for a long time. And so I'm asking you to please keep to this timeline. The worst case scenario is that next year we have another year of work in progress and we can see how far we are and we can say, does 2028 still make sense? Can we still do it? But giving that time now means they will take that time. We all will. I'm like an exceptional procrastinator. I just sent my slides moments ago to this committee because I just finished testimony. Like if you give anybody time, it is human nature to take it. And those 18 months are not just 18 months on paper. They are 18 months that will affect your communities. They will affect the bottom line of the state of Vermont. And they are just kicking the can down the road. And we've known we've needed to do this for a very, 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 very long time. And then I'm just gonna like throw in, I'll even offer up something. I'm representing an environmental organization. I have background in science and I believe deeply in protecting our natural resources, our habitats and ecology. And later this week, you're going to hear about a provision change in the miscellaneous bill for stream alteration jurisdictional swap. That will say, instead of doing something that's like high up in perennial streams, we are recommending jurisdictional trigger for needing a stream alt permit being broadened. And normally an environmental organization would not say, yeah, that makes sense. We would say like, whoa, 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 we got to protect those natural resources. We've looked at that. We looked at the language. And if it actually does free up, because the reason that is being requested is because of administrative burden on state staff, specifically the Rivers program. If that frees up more Rivers time and staff to work on this, we are okay with it. So like, let's get to work. Let's not delay this. We can come back next year at this time and see where we are. Please don't do it. Thank you.
Thanks for your testimony. Any further questions? That was great. Representative Austin.
Yeah, just, I know this might be a hard question to answer, but is there a way to substantiate that this issue is directly related to climate change and not taking action on climate change? Or is it not able to be substantiated?
I guess I'm a little confused by the prompt, but I'll say that this exact provision for limiting development of river corridors is in the state's climate action plan of 2021, and is in line with climate science that shows warmer, wetter, more hazardous flood seasons. And again, that mirrors our actual flood profile and all of the money that we receive from FEMA or used to receive.
Representative Chapin.
Given your experience sort of post Irene and then through a number of other extreme events, can you speak a little bit about how towns operate now in this day and age compared to 20 years ago? We have so many relatively small municipalities. We don't have much regional infrastructure for governance or financial support. So can you speak to sort of from your experience, what you've seen in the dynamics of how towns can operate financially, like just the viability, the stability, the resiliency of towns? I'm thinking personally, I observe some things financially about towns that are struggling, and just in being able to retain staff. And Waterbury's been in the news on this topic, but so many towns basically have one staff person and everybody else doing everything else as volunteers. I guess, could you just speak to that? Because our town is, our state has a lot of different sized municipalities.
Yeah, it's brutal and it's overwhelming. I actually, when I was adding the images of all the different floods from around the state, many of which fall on your constituency, I purposely left in a couple that were just like road damage. Like road damage isn't as like evocative as looking at a house that was destroyed, but happens everywhere and it will destroy a town's budget. You represent Middlesex. Middlesex gets repeatedly hammered on their road budget from flooding, whether they're these like micro events or the big ones that happen across the states. And so the ability of a small, especially rural town to navigate not only like, how do I do the FEMA floodplain insurance? Like, how do I make sure that we can stay in good standing? How do I create a local emergency plan so that I can get access to FEMA mitigation funds? How do we manage a budget and all of the other things that a town has to do and support our towns that have like been developed against our rivers and have this patchwork of regulatory system that has left largely our rural communities who are understaffed, like hurting. There's been heavy reliance on state emergency management and natural resources staff for technical expertise. Director Forand from VEM's testimony this morning spoke to the lack of federal funding coming in and then needing to pull back technical assistance to towns. That will have a direct impact on the Regional Planning Commission's budget. And they are a huge supporter of towns and developing their plans and understanding the different regulations. They've been immensely helpful, and yet they are now going to start probably losing some funding because they have received quite a bit of funding from FEMA to do this exact planning work and technical work for the towns. So it's, like I said, the calculus has even shifted since the last time I was here 2 years ago talking about it, with changes to FEMA and funding coming out to states that have made our, especially rural towns, even more vulnerable.
Thank you again for your presentation.
Thank you all.
All right, members, we have one more witness for lunch. And I just want to introduce the topic of, the rulemaking for the executive order pertaining to wetlands is underway, and many of us are getting a lot of being copied on the inputs that folks are giving through the portal. Please join us, Laura. I just have picked a couple of folks and asked them if they would come in and present their perspectives on it. And Hill Eubanks is joining us right now. Attorney, and so had a different perspective, and then we'll have George Springston in later tomorrow. I guess we're having him in. He's a geologist, so he's got a different perspective, but we won't. Welcome, Laura.
Hi. My name is Laura Hill Eubanks. I'm an attorney from Northfield, and I have a master's degree in environmental law and policy. I have served as the chair of my town planning commission, the chair of my regional planning commission, Central Vermont, and my town conservation commission. Currently, I work with individuals and organizations on policy issues, but today I'm here representing myself.
Sorry.
Yeah, would you be able to speak up just a little bit?
Right. Very low voice, sorry. I'm here to give the committee an overview of the comments that I submitted to the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation regarding the current wetlands rulemaking initiated by the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources in response to the governor's executive order EO-06-25. The executive order seems to be generally well-intended. It seeks to increase the availability of housing for Vermonters that cannot afford housing in the current economic environment. I don't disagree that we need more housing. I do agree that we need more housing that's accessible to more people. I do strongly disagree with the method that the governor and secretary are seeking to build more housing. The current wetlands rulemaking would allow housing to be built in any unmapped Class 2 wetlands in designated growth areas in the state. So that would include downtowns, village centers, new town centers, growth centers, neighborhood development areas, and opportunity zones. The rulemaking would also allow housing to be built within 25 feet of all Class 2 wetlands in those growth areas. This would cut the current required protected buffer zone wetlands in half and allow for setback of only 25 feet from development. Building houses in wetlands and close to wetlands can have very serious impacts. Wetlands provide a number of very important functions and services These include flood control, pollution filtration and water quality improvement, drought prevention, shoreline stabilization and erosion control, carbon storage, and fish and wildlife habitat. Development in and closer to wetlands results in the loss of the functions that they provide. My biggest concern with the executive order and the rulemaking is the loss of the function of flood control and flood damage mitigation that the impacted wetlands would normally provide. This is especially important as climate change is causing an increase in the frequency and intensity of floods. The science on that is basically that over time, the floods have increased and they have increased in intensity. And in Vermont, we've seen that over and over again. Barre and Montpelier have been devastated by floods. My town has been really damaged by floods in Northfield. And an increase in floods means an increase in the flood damages to homes, businesses, and public infrastructure. The website of the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation describes very well the benefits that wetlands provide in reducing flood impact. On their website, they state, many wetlands, particularly floodplain wetlands, have the capacity to temporarily store floodwaters during high runoff events. Wetlands can reduce the severity of downstream flooding and erosion. In watersheds where wetlands have been lost, flood peaks may increase by as much as 80%. With wetlands within and upstream of urban areas are particularly valuable for flood protection. The impervious surface in urban areas greatly increases the rate and volume of runoff, thereby increasing the risk of flood damage. State lawmakers have recognized that the wetlands are very important to the health, safety, and welfare of our residents. The Vermont legislature recently passed Act 121, called the Flood Safety Act, with bipartisan support. The law provides a clear mandate to not only protect wetlands in Vermont, but to achieve wetland gains as part of an effort to increase flood resilience. The policy to be followed under the state law, now found in Title 10, Chapter 7 of the statutes, is clear. The wetlands of the state shall be protected, regulated, and restored so that Vermont achieves a net gain of wetlands acreage. The regulation and management of the water resources of the state, including wetlands, should be guided by science. I just want to take a minute to say that I did send my full comments to the committee. I don't know if you have them in front of you. Okay. Under the law, the Secretary of A&R is required to amend the Vermont wetland rules to clarify that the goal of wetlands regulation is the net gain of wetlands. And that is to be achieved through protecting existing wetlands. All right, Lawson, please. And the restoration of wetlands that were previously adversely affected. The wetlands rules shall prioritize the protection of existing intact wetlands from adverse effects. The statutes further require that the buffer zones for Class 2 wetland extend at least 50 feet from the border of a wetland based on the functions and values listed in the statute. Currently, wetlands that meet the criteria of a Class 2 wetland are protected by law, whether they're mapped or not. The determination as to whether a wetland is a Class 2 wetland and merits protection is to be based on an evaluation of the extent to which it serves the functions and values as listed in the statutes, or by its identification on the Vermont significant wetlands maps. Note that one of the most important functions included in the statute is that of flood control. Not all wetlands have been mapped as part of the effort to more effectively protect the state wetlands. The statutes require that state wetland maps be updated periodically. But the intent of the law is clearly that all wetlands that meet the criteria for Class 2 must be protected, mapped or not. The goal of net gain of wetlands is intended to be achieved in part by requiring that any activity in a wetland that would adversely impact more than 5,000 square feet be compensated by the permit applicant through restoration, enhancement, or creation of a wetland or buffers. Under the amendment to the rules proposed by the secretary, there would be no permit required for building housing in wetlands or part of their buffers. This seems to imply that building houses, that under the rule amendments, no compensation for permanent impacts would be required in these instances. This is not at all in keeping with the net gain of wetlands under the law. Under the new rules, housing construction would become an allowed use with no permit required, meaning impacts to the wetland would not be reviewed by the wetlands program, and there would be no wetland protections in these cases. That is a drastic change from how the rules work now under the statutes. The rule amendments run counter to the statutes and their intent to protect existing Class 2 wetlands and the buffers of at least 50 feet. The statute does not say that only mapped wetlands will be protected. The statute states very clearly that existing wetlands shall be given priority for protection. The secretary may have some discretion in the implementation of the statute, but they do not have the authority to fully ignore its clear intent. In addition to the statutory protections for wetlands, planning policies have recently been put in place by the state of Vermont to address and prevent the impacts caused by climate change. The first plan is the Vermont Action Plan of 2025, which recognizes the importance of wetlands and recommends their expansion as part of the effort to increase flood resilience. A scientific paper cited in the plan estimated that the floodplain wetlands in the Otter Creek watershed reduced potential damage to Middlebury during Tropical Storm Irene by at least 6 times and as much as 20 times. The second state plan cited is the Vermont Resilience Implementation Strategy. This explained that the loss of wetlands means the loss of the monetary value of flood protection and other functions they provide. Plan recommends conserving wetlands and pointed out a study that found that the value of flood protection provided by the floodplain wetlands in the Otter Creek watershed near Middlebury was estimated to exceed $120,000 and maybe as high as $450,000. I'd like to point out that in the rules with the Secretary of State, that the Secretary of A&R referenced these 2 policy plans that I just cited, the Vermont Resilience Implementation Strategy and the Vermont Climate Action Plan, to make the case that the wetlands rules should allow houses to be built in wetlands. The Secretary stated that these 2 plans advocate for smart growth in compact growth areas, and I quote, "While wetlands provide important environmental and economic benefits such as flood control and water quality functions, the impact to wetland functions will be confined to a limited number of wetlands, and any negative impacts will be balanced by advancing housing construction in compact growth areas." But the Secretary fails to recognize or acknowledge 2 key points. First, smart growth is defined into Vermont law as growth that includes protections for the state's important natural resources, including wetlands. Second, the plans and policy that they cite strongly recommend protecting wetlands for their value in increasing climate change resilience. These state planning policy documents recognize that safe and effective development strategies in the face of climate change will require policies that work to accomplish both objectives, compact growth and flood resilience. In the rule filing, the Secretary was required to provide an economic impact analysis, which is meant to be an analysis of the costs and benefits of the rule. But there is no real tangible economic analysis provided in the filing. The Secretary acknowledges that wetlands provide important environmental and economic functions, and that this rule negatively impacts some wetlands and their functions in designated areas, but that any negative impacts will be balanced by advancing housing construction in compact growth areas. However, no monetary values or comparisons or any factual data are given to support the assertions. If the Secretary had undertaken an adequate economic analysis in the rule filing, they would likely have found that building housing in wetlands is more costly than building on more suitable dry lands and may not result in an increase of housing that is affordable. Building houses in a wetland will increase the impervious surface while also removing the capacity for water storage in those wetland areas. This could increase runoff and flood risk and impact even damage the properties nearby. In addition, the total cost to build housing in a wetland may be doubled or tripled in comparison to the average home built on dry land. Added cost to prevent water and flood damage can include soil stabilization through added soils, compaction and drainage systems, special foundations that may involve pilings to ensure stability, special engineering and construction personnel, and flood insurance. And building in an area with a high water table like wetlands could lead to failed wastewater and septic systems. Even if the house can be built, the wet soils and raised water levels during heavy rains can cause shifting soils, damaged foundations, damp and wet areas of the home, mold, and erosion. And if the house is not built to be resistant to flood and water infiltration, then the homeowner may experience more impacts than if it had been. Long-term, the cost could be significant. Allowing people to build where no wetlands have been mapped may also provide a false sense of security. Homeowners may be led to believe that it is safe to build in an area where no wetlands have been mapped. Homeowners as well as builders may not even know that wetlands in fact exist in these areas. And will the state require homeowners be provided notice of the potential for building houses in those wetlands? The loss of a wetland due to development also results in a loss of the beneficial ecosystem services that an intact wetland can provide. The storage of floodwaters and flood mitigation, water filtration and improved water quality, drought prevention, carbon storage, fish and wildlife habitat. These services provide economic value and would likely be costly to replace. And the Otter Creek study found that wetlands and floodplains prevented 84 to 95% in flood damages to buildings in Middlebury during Tropical Storm Irene, saving them as much as $1.8 million. An analysis of Vermont's investment in land conservation found that for every dollar the state spent, communities received about $9 worth of natural benefits. Tropical Storm Irene alone caused flood damages in Vermont estimated at more than $600 million. There are real costs for development of housing in wetlands, both environmental and economic. Those costs have not been provided in this rulemaking process. In the rule filings, the Secretary was required to explain why the proposed rule is not arbitrary. The Secretary answered that the rule is not arbitrary in part because it is supported by data collected by state government, as well as agency staff and wetlands professionals. In addition, science intends that any regulation of wetlands be based in science. I do not see data or science included in this filing that would support building houses in wetlands. As you can see by all the information I've just provided, which may be more than you wanted to know, but there is a lot of data and science available to show that building in wetlands is not a very well supported idea. And in fact, wetlands should actually be protected to prevent the increased risk of flooding. The Vermont legislature recognized the need for protection of wetlands as part of an effort to protect people and property from the increasingly frequent and intense flooding caused by climate change. They enacted laws and statutes that clearly require increasing protections for wetlands, not removing those protections. The rules are in direct conflict with the statutes. As someone who served on public planning commissions, my perspective is that a reasonable but careful balance must be struck between the need for development and the need to protect valuable natural resources. Both are necessary for the health, safety, and welfare of our society, but that balance is not being struck in this rulemaking. This rulemaking increases the risk of flooding and the potential for harm to our residents and property. We can create affordable housing without destroying natural resources as valuable as wetlands, and one that provides us with the means to keep areas of development safer and more resilient. It has been stated that the Secretary would like the environmental community to provide them with alternatives to building in unmapped wetlands and buffers. I suggest they request resources that would allow A&R to identify and map the remaining wetlands in the designated growth areas before deciding it's acceptable to fill them in and build houses on them. For all these reasons, and the proposed, for all these reasons, the proposed rules and any laws that may be similar, I believe should be rejected. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Do members have questions? Do you have a question?
I have a statement. I just want to thank for this testimony
Okay.
because I find it very compelling and it looks like you put a lot of time into it and I just really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for coming in and sharing your testimony. Thanks. With that, we're finished for the morning. We have Will Grady coming in to actually walk us through the Public Safety Act. I just feel like it's important for us to revisit that statute. And if there's time, he will also be walking us through another water-related bill that